Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that the most dangerous stretch of road in the world is not a war zone, not a terrorist target, and not a natural disaster area, but a simple 2-kilometer bridge connecting Windsor, Ontario to Detroit, Michigan? And what if I told you that this single span of steel and concrete carries more economic power than most countries possess, with the ability to shut down American manufacturing within hours and cripple the world's largest economy through nothing more than a traffic delay? Most people believe economic warfare requires armies, sanctions, or sophisticated cyber attacks. They assume that controlling major economies demands vast military resources or complex financial instruments. They do not recognize what I recognize: the complete vulnerability of modern industrial systems to geographic choke points so narrow that a single decision by Canadian officials can paralyze American production across multiple states and industries. This is not theoretical vulnerability. This is mathematical certainty operating through the most concentrated flow of industrial dependency ever created between two nations. The Ambassador Bridge spans just 2.3 kilometers of the Detroit River, connecting downtown Detroit with Windsor, Ontario. To casual observers, it appears to be nothing more than a busy border crossing, one of many that facilitate trade between the United States and Canada. But this perception misses the fundamental reality that defines North American industrial production. The Ambassador Bridge carries 25% of all trade between the United States and Canada, making it the single most economically critical transportation link on the continent. More than 8,000 commercial vehicles cross the Ambassador Bridge daily, carrying components, raw materials, and finished products that feed manufacturing operations throughout the American Midwest and Ontario. This represents one commercial vehicle every 10.8 seconds during peak hours, creating a continuous flow of industrial inputs that American manufacturing depends on for basic operational continuity. The mathematical precision of this dependency reveals how completely North American industry has been restructured around the assumption of uninterrupted cross-border flow through a single geographic choke point. Ford's Dearborn facility, located just 15 kilometers from the Ambassador Bridge, maintains only 2 hours of component inventory, because just-in-time delivery systems assume reliable 15-minute border crossings that have operated consistently for decades. General Motors' Detroit operations depend on Canadian manufactured transmissions that arrive every 90 minutes during peak production periods. These transmissions travel from Windsor assembly facilities directly to Detroit production lines via the Ambassador Bridge, creating a supply chain so tightly integrated that any disruption in border crossing times immediately affects production schedules and worker employment. Chrysler's operations throughout Michigan utilize Canadian engines, electrical systems, and steel components that flow across the Ambassador Bridge multiple times during the production process. A single vehicle produced in American facilities may contain components that have crossed the Ambassador Bridge 4 or 5 times during various stages of manufacturing, assembly, and finishing operations. The vulnerability of this system became apparent during the February 2025 border crisis, when Canadian customs officials implemented enhanced inspection procedures in response to American tariff threats and diplomatic pressure regarding Canadian trade relationships with China. What began as a routine policy adjustment became a demonstration of Canadian leverage that revealed the complete dependence of American manufacturing on Canadian cooperation and Canadian border management decisions. Average crossing times increased from 15 minutes to 4 hours as Canadian officials conducted detailed examinations of commercial shipments that had previously received expedited processing under established trade protocols developed over decades of cooperative border management. The inspection procedures were technically within Canadian legal authority and did not violate any trade agreements, but they transformed the Ambassador Bridge from a reliable transportation link into an unpredictable bottleneck that could not support integrated just-in-time manufacturing systems. The specific mechanics of the inspection process revealed how easily Canadian officials could disrupt American supply chains without creating grounds for formal diplomatic complaints or trade dispute procedures. Canadian customs officers began requiring detailed documentation for components that had previously been processed under streamlined procedures. They implemented physical inspections of shipments that had previously been approved through electronic documentation systems. They required additional certifications for materials that had previously been accepted under mutual recognition agreements. Each of these requirements was individually reasonable and legally justified, but their cumulative effect was to transform 15-minute border crossings into 4-hour delays that made just-in-time manufacturing impossible. American companies found themselves subject to Canadian regulatory procedures that were technically proper but practically devastating for operations that had been designed around assumptions of predictable border processing times. The economic impact was immediate and catastrophic for American manufacturing operations. Within 48 hours of the enhanced inspection procedures, 14 American factories had shut down production due to component shortages. Ford's Dearborn facility sent 12,000 workers home when Canadian transmissions failed to arrive on schedule. General Motors' Detroit operations ceased production for 6 consecutive days, while management attempted to locate alternative component sources that did not exist. The total economic impact of the 6-day border disruption exceeded $4.2 billion in lost production, canceled orders, and emergency supply chain expenses. General Motors alone lost $1.04 billion in revenue during the crisis, with internal company documents revealing that 60% of these losses were attributed directly to what executives privately described as the Canada factor. But the most revealing aspect of the crisis was not the immediate economic costs, but the complete inability of American companies to develop alternative supply sources or transportation routes that could bypass the Ambassador Bridge chokepoint. Decades of industrial integration had created production systems so dependent on predictable cross-border flow that alternatives were economically impossible and logistically impractical. American companies discovered that moving production components through other border crossings added 400 kilometers to transportation routes, increasing shipping costs by 40 or 60% and delivery times by 6 to 12 hours that made just-in-time manufacturing impossible. The Blue Water Bridge between Sarnia and Port Huron, located 100 kilometers north of the Ambassador Bridge, lacked the infrastructure capacity to handle more than a fraction of the commercial traffic that normally flowed through Detroit-Windsor corridor. The Peace Bridge between Buffalo and Fort Erie added even greater distances and transportation costs, while providing no additional processing capacity that could accommodate diverted traffic. Alternative crossings had been designed to handle regional traffic, rather than the concentrated industrial flows that had developed around the Ambassador Bridge over decades of manufacturing integration. Canadian and American customs facilities at these alternative locations lacked the specialized equipment, trained personnel, and processing systems needed to handle automotive components, chemical shipments, and other industrial materials that required specific handling procedures and documentation requirements. More fundamentally, American manufacturing facilities had been located based on the assumption of reliable access through the Ambassador Bridge, making alternative transportation routes economically prohibitive, even when they were logistically possible. Ford's Dearborn facility was positioned to receive components from Windsor suppliers via 15-minute truck deliveries that could not be replicated through longer transportation routes that added hours to delivery schedules and thousands of dollars to shipping costs. The integrated nature of Detroit-Windsor manufacturing meant that components often crossed the Ambassador Bridge multiple times during various stages of production, assembly, and finishing. Alternative border crossings could not accommodate these complex multi-stage logistics flows that had been optimized around the specific infrastructure and processing capabilities available at the Ambassador Bridge. Air freight alternatives proved economically prohibitive for most manufacturing components, with emergency air shipments costing 15-20 times more than normal truck transportation, while providing only a fraction of the cargo capacity that regular operations required. Even emergency air freight options were limited by airport cargo handling capacity and customs processing capabilities that could not accommodate the volume of materials that crossed the Ambassador Bridge daily. The crisis revealed that American manufacturing had become dependent not just on Canadian components, but on Canadian cooperation in maintaining the specific logistical systems that made cross-border production economically viable. The Ambassador Bridge represented more than a transportation route. It represented a system of integrated customs procedures, coordinated inspection processes, and mutual regulatory cooperation that had evolved over decades to facilitate the smooth flow of goods between integrated production systems. When Canadian officials decided to implement enhanced inspection procedures, they were not simply slowing down individual shipments, they were disrupting an entire industrial ecosystem that depended on predictable processing times, standardized documentation procedures, and cooperative enforcement of trade regulations. American companies found themselves subject to Canadian policy decisions that they could not influence and Canadian regulatory procedures that they could not circumvent. The psychological impact on American manufacturing leadership was profound. Executives who had built careers around the assumption of reliable cross-border supply chains found themselves managing production systems that could be disrupted overnight by decisions made in Canadian government offices. Board meetings that had previously focused on American market conditions and American regulatory requirements now included detailed discussions of Canadian political developments and Canadian border policies that could affect American production schedules. The transformation was most visible in the automotive industry, where American companies began restructuring their production plans around the assumption that Canadian border policies could change without warning and without consideration for American business needs. Ford established emergency inventory stockpiles at facilities near the Ambassador Bridge, increasing storage costs, but providing buffer against potential Canadian border delays. General Motors implemented dual sourcing strategies that maintained both Canadian suppliers and alternative suppliers from Mexico and other countries, even though alternative suppliers were more expensive and less reliable than traditional Canadian partners. The company characterized these additional costs as border insurance, rather than normal production expenses, acknowledging that they were paying premium prices to protect against Canadian policy decisions. Chrysler adopted the most comprehensive response by establishing manufacturing facilities on both sides of the Ambassador Bridge, creating redundant production capabilities that could continue operations even if cross-border component flows were disrupted. This strategy required substantial capital investment and resulted in higher production costs, but provided operational security that single-location facilities could not match. The broader implications of American vulnerability to Canadian border control became apparent when other industries recognized similar dependencies on cross-border flow through the Ambassador Bridge. Energy companies that imported Canadian electricity and natural gas through infrastructure connections near the bridge discovered that their operations were subject to the same Canadian policy decisions that affected manufacturing companies. Chemical companies that processed Canadian raw materials in American facilities found themselves dependent on reliable border crossings for essential inputs that could not be quickly sourced from alternative suppliers. Agricultural processors that handled Canadian grain, livestock, and other products discovered that their operations were vulnerable to Canadian decisions about border processing priorities and inspection procedures. The cumulative effect was the recognition that entire sectors of American industry had become dependent on Canadian cooperation for basic operational continuity. This dependency operated through the geographic choke point of the Ambassador Bridge, but it reflected broader integration of American and Canadian production systems that made American industry vulnerable to Canadian policy decisions across multiple sectors and regions. The Canadian response to American recognition of this vulnerability revealed the strategic sophistication that American policymakers had consistently underestimated and demonstrated how completely Canadian officials understood the leverage that geographic control provided over American economic and political decision-making processes. Instead of viewing border control as a purely administrative function designed to facilitate trade and maintain security, Canadian officials began treating border policies as sophisticated tools for advancing broader Canadian strategic objectives and protecting Canadian interests in trade negotiations, diplomatic relationships, and economic partnerships with third countries. The transformation was systematic and carefully coordinated across multiple levels of Canadian government and administrative agencies. Canadian customs procedures were gradually adjusted to prioritize shipments from companies that maintained substantial Canadian employment, invested in Canadian facility expansion, and demonstrated long-term commitment to Canadian economic development over companies that viewed Canada primarily as a source of inexpensive inputs for American manufacturing operations. Companies that had relocated production facilities from Canada to Mexico, China, or other countries found themselves subject to enhanced inspection procedures that increased their border crossing times and transportation costs, while companies that maintained or expanded Canadian operations continued to receive expedited processing that supported their integrated supply chain requirements. Canadian officials began coordinating border policies with broader trade negotiations and diplomatic initiatives, using the threat of enhanced inspection procedures and processing delays as negotiating tools to encourage American companies to maintain Canadian partnerships and discourage them from pursuing supply chain diversification strategies that would reduce Canadian employment or Canadian economic benefits. The most sophisticated element of this strategy involves selective enforcement of existing border regulations that had previously been applied flexibly to accommodate American business needs and maintain the smooth flow of integrated production systems. By implementing full compliance requirements for regulations that had been on the books but loosely enforced, Canadian officials could slow American supply chains without creating new restrictions that might violate trade agreements or provide grounds for formal American complaints through dispute resolution mechanisms. Canadian officials began coordinating border policies with broader trade negotiations, using the threat of enhanced inspection procedures to encourage American companies to maintain Canadian partnerships and discourage them from pursuing supply chain diversification that would reduce Canadian employment or Canadian economic benefits. The most sophisticated Canadian strategy involved selective enforcement of existing border regulations that had previously been applied flexibly to accommodate American business needs. By implementing full compliance requirements without creating new regulations, Canadian officials could slow American supply chains without violating trade agreements or creating grounds for formal American complaints. This approach provided Canada with substantial leverage over American companies and American policy decisions while maintaining the legal and diplomatic framework of cooperative border management. American companies found themselves subject to Canadian policy pressure that they could not formally protest because it involved enforcement of mutually agreed regulations rather than new restrictions or discriminatory treatment. The strategic effectiveness of Canadian border leverage became apparent during the 2025 USMCA trade negotiations, when American negotiators found themselves under pressure from American business interests to accommodate Canadian positions on issues that had previously been viewed as purely American domestic concerns. American agricultural associations lobbied American negotiators to accept Canadian positions on agricultural trade issues because Canadian border delays were affecting American farming operations that depended on Canadian fertilizer and other inputs. American manufacturing associations supported Canadian positions on labor standards because Canadian border policies were affecting American factories that depended on Canadian components. The most significant development was the emergence of American business coalitions that actively supported Canadian negotiating positions and Canadian policy preferences, because they recognized that Canadian cooperation was essential for their operational continuity and long-term profitability. These coalitions represented a fundamental shift in American political dynamics and interest group alignment, as American business interests began supporting foreign policy positions that prioritized Canadian relationships over traditional American negotiating objectives and American political independence. The Michigan Automotive Alliance, representing companies that employed over 200,000 workers in facilities dependent on Ambassador Bridge traffic flows, began lobbying American political leaders to accommodate Canadian positions on trade disputes, environmental regulations, and diplomatic relationships with third countries. The alliance argued that American manufacturing competitiveness depended on maintaining Canadian cooperation, and that American negotiating positions that threatened Canadian interests ultimately threatened American jobs and American economic prosperity. Similar coalitions emerged in Ohio, Indiana, and other states, where manufacturing operations depended on reliable cross-border flows through the Ambassador Bridge. The Ohio Manufacturing Association established a permanent office in Ottawa to maintain relationships with Canadian government officials and Canadian business leaders who could affect border policies and customs procedures that determined the viability of Ohio manufacturing operations. These American business coalitions began engaging in what amounted to independent diplomatic relationships with Canadian government agencies, Canadian regulatory bodies, and Canadian political leaders, sometimes pursuing objectives that conflicted with official American government positions and American foreign policy priorities. American companies found themselves lobbying Canadian officials to maintain policies that benefited American operations, even when those policies conflicted with broader American strategic objectives. Canadian officials recognized this political leverage and began engaging directly with American business associations, labor unions, regional development agencies, and state and local political leaders to build support for Canadian positions within American domestic political processes. Instead of relying solely on traditional government-to-government diplomatic channels, Canada developed sophisticated influence networks within American political and economic systems that could affect American policy decisions through domestic political pressure and interest group advocacy. The effectiveness of this strategy became apparent when American congressional representatives from districts that depended on cross-border trade began supporting Canadian positions on issues that had previously been viewed as conflicts between American and Canadian interests. Representatives from Michigan, Ohio, and other border states found themselves advocating for policies that accommodated Canadian concerns because their constituents' economic interests depended on maintaining Canadian cooperation. The transformation of American political dynamics represented one of the most significant but least recognized consequences of American dependency on the Ambassador Bridge chokepoint. Canadian officials had successfully converted American economic vulnerability into American political influence that operated through American democratic processes and American business interests. The long-term implications of this transformation extend beyond immediate trade relationships to encompass fundamental questions about American economic sovereignty and American ability to pursue independent policy objectives. American policymakers discovered that their negotiating positions were constrained by the need to maintain Canadian cooperation for basic industrial operations. The military implications were equally significant, as American defense production became dependent on Canadian components and Canadian cooperation. The Pentagon began conducting vulnerability assessments of defense supply chains that depended on cross-border flow through the Ambassador Bridge. The Ambassador Bridge had become more than a transportation choke point. It had become a strategic vulnerability that affected American economic sovereignty, political independence, and national security through dependencies that American policymakers were struggling to address. The mathematical reality of this vulnerability cannot be overstated. A 2-kilometer bridge carries economic flows that exceed the gross domestic product of most countries. The suspension of normal operations for just 1 week would cost the American economy more than most natural disasters. The geographic concentration of this economic power represents an unprecedented situation in modern international relations. Never before has such a large economy become so dependent on cooperation through such a narrow geographic bottleneck with no practical alternatives. The Ambassador Bridge controls integrated production systems that cannot be quickly relocated because they represent decades of industrial investment. American manufacturing has become dependent on Canadian cooperation not just for materials that could be sourced elsewhere, but for integrated production systems that cannot function without predictable cross-border flow. This dependency represents the most sophisticated form of economic control ever achieved between neighboring countries. When Canadian officials meet to discuss border management policies, they are effectively determining American manufacturing schedules, American employment levels, and American political stability in regions that depend on cross-border industrial integration. The Ambassador Bridge has become the physical manifestation of American vulnerability to Canadian control, operating through a geographic choke point so narrow that Canadian decisions about traffic flow can determine American economic outcomes. 2 kilometers of steel and concrete have become more powerful than military assets in determining American economic security and political independence.